Thanks very much, and good morning. It's absolutely wonderful to be, particularly at this conference, because those of us who work on the mental health side know of the tremendous connection and often unfortunate connection between mental health or mental illness and the justice system. In fact, one of the most recent initiatives that we had at NIMH was specifically around trying to get effective interventions for mental illness in the broad criminal justice or justice system sector. So we're very grateful. I'm very grateful to be here and grateful to engage in dialogue as much as possible with you. That said, I'll speak for just a couple of minutes. So across all of health, we have a pretty spotty record, unfortunately, of getting effective interventions in practice. Many people will cite the 17-year gap after which only a fraction of our scientific findings ever make their way to truly impact people's health. And the bottom line from this kind of analysis that says what happens when science is completed and you're waiting for that gap, what we find is that publication alone doesn't work. Too often science is really is shared within, as we know, publications that unfortunately are more likely to sit on the shelf than they are to really benefit people. And the gap really persists across all of health, but we feel it very, very strongly within mental health, where according to large epidemiological surveys, really only 40 to 50% with any of our mental disorders get anything, get any services. And of those, it's been calculated that only about a third get what would be considered minimally acceptable care. So that gap between research and practice is incredibly strong here. This led us at the National Institute of Mental Health to have a significant focus on dissemination and implementation research, which we really saw as the knowledge base, the translational science that some people would call T2, or now in more common terms, T3, T4, T12. But basically, how do you get from effective interventions to actually become standard care? The challenge, of course, is multiple-fold. The typical development of practice, of practices of interventions is pretty linear. The assumption is you develop your treatment. You then subject it in a very pristine test in an efficacy trial to see if there's a signal. You then expand a little bit into effectiveness, and then after that you think about, okay, now how do we get this implemented within care? Unfortunately, many of our researchers, with the incredible expertise they have, don't know as much about the variety within actual practice. And so they're not as well suited toward trying to figure out how my intervention that I developed and tested can be used as broadly as possible. There's also few incentives for many of our interventions to be used. So there isn't always the business case that say that profits are going to accrue if one uses a particular treatment. There's also a workforce that isn't always as well resourced as we find within trials. Trials often include people that people can have their pick of who's going to deliver a particular intervention, but the workforce has many, many more constraints on them. There's also within science really a tremendous focus on internal validity, but not as much on generalizability. And of course, when we're talking about the ultimate uptake of effective interventions, we're really wanting things to be as generalizable as possible. So in 2002, NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, issued a specific call for applications around dissemination and implementation research. We saw it as two overlapping but pretty significant challenges. Dissemination, how do we understand best how to transfer knowledge from science into practice? And implementation, which was more of how do you embed effective interventions within a variety of practice settings. This first program announcement called for prospective efforts to improve uptake of interventions at the individual, at the organization, and even at broader system and policy levels. In 2005, as we were recognizing that, again, within mental health, this was by no means only our problem, but actually extended across health, we engaged in a process through which we brought the NIMH announcement across all of NIH. So we now have 12 or 13 institutes and centers involved in our announcement. We were able to create a centralized review committee. One of the concerns was that people who are engaged in this science, it requires different expertise. It may require different designs, and as a result, may benefit from having particular expertise doing the review of those kind of applications. We began annual meetings that were also intended to develop this large community of practice, community of science around people who are engaged in this work. In the first year, we had, I think, about 300 people who attended. Just in the last few years, it's quadrupled. Yeah, 1,200 in this last year. We're also benefiting from a centralized reporting system where all of the information accruing from these different trials are gathered and actually reported to the Secretary of Health and Human Services quarterly. And I think the value of this certainly is in really keeping our feet to the fire, making sure that as a broad field that we're advancing not only solving individual problems, but really trying to build a field of knowledge. And we're also working to build the capacity for dissemination and implementation research. We have a number of summer training institutes that bring a cohort of investigators on site for a week to really learn as much as possible about the variety of questions and tools in dissemination and implementation research. The current state of the field for us in mental health, and really in health more broadly, we've had a nice shift. For a long time, we were solely focused on identifying barriers and facilitators. Why aren't things working? Why can't we figure out how to get practices that seem to be great off the shelf and into the hands of people who can benefit? We've nicely moved more into the efficacy kind of work, more toward testing and implementation strategy, assuming that the best case scenario is not necessarily a front-end training and then some technical assistance, but really now trying to look at comparative effectiveness of much more active strategies. It's not easy to get the practices that we know work to become standard care. And so thinking much more prospectively and proactively around what's the opportunities to ultimately see that a practice can not only be implemented, but hopefully sustained over time. That really gets us to the horizon, and this is where I think not only just within the health sector, but across all of our sectors, we can do a lot more to try and think about sustainability and really broader scale up. Even within our studies, when they've been able to randomize it, in some cases counties, or be able to look across states, we're still not able to make that biggest jump. It ought to be that the scientific findings become beneficial for everybody, and we think that it's only through this kind of dialogue and really the opportunity to connect with all of you and to learn from all of you that we're going to get there. So I'm going to stop here, but look forward to the discussion and appreciate your attention. So thank you.